Alright guys, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So the plan today is to finish off that chapter 8 talking about labor markets and those different trends, and then we're going to cover chapter 9, which is talking about savings, investment, and wealth. So let's jump right in. So last time we left off by discussing the first trend, the increasing real wages trend, right? And how, there's been sustained productivity growth due to technological progress in the last 100 years, right? So this is talking about increasing wages in the 20th century. And then our second trend that we talked about was that since 1970, there's been what's called stagnated wage growth. And so why did we see stagnated wealth growth? Well, there could be two reasons, right? It could be because there's slower growth in the demand for labor, actually I should probably do something like this, right? That makes way more sense. But the demand for labor, or it could be because of faster growth in the supply of labor. So some empirical evidence here, right? When we look at the different time periods, we look at 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 2000, 2000 to 10, and then 10 to 16, which is the latest data that they have there. When we look at the productivity growth and the real earnings growth, we see that, they go pretty much hand in hand. Productivity growth, 0.8%, real earnings, 0.6%. Productivity growth, 1.5%, real earnings, 1.3%. But then we get productivity growth, oh no, this is okay, 2%, and then 2.2%. Between 2000 and 2010, we get productivity growth of 1.5%. And now we have half of that in terms of real earnings, right? So we start to get a separation between the productivity growth and the real earnings growth. But then that separation, because productivity slowed down so much, that separation started to go away, right? And productivity started to reflect real wages once again. So what's been happening here? Well, slower demand growth does explain some of the slower wage growth. The slower demand growth, right? We're talking about, the periods of recessions or economic downturns, right? But how can there be at the same time there's rapid growth in employment? So this probably isn't the main reason. For those stagnating wages. The supply of labor must have increased as well. And we have seen this, right? There's the increase in the labor force participation rate of women. More women entering the workforce. We've got just a greater amount of people because of the baby boom. And then, you know, we've got higher rates of immigration than, you know, in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. So looking forward, you know, are we still going to have stagnated wage growth? Well, it really just depends on if the labor supply growth is going to slow down and whether productivity continues to decline. So, you know, if we ask ourselves, you know, will this continue? The answer is probably. Unless labor supply growth slows, like there's a giant epidemic that cuts down on a lot of the population worldwide. Too soon? Or whether productivity growth continues to decline. Any questions about trend 2, the stagnated wage growth since 1970? And one of the things that is not talked about here, but it's one of the more political elements of economics, right? Economics really started with political economy, right? But a lot of political economists will talk about, you know, the union busting that happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. You know, when Reagan was president, when Thatcher was prime minister of England, they had policies, you know, that were specifically to break up unions. And so the result was that union power decreased significantly and labor power as a result decreased significantly, which caused a lot of this labor stagnation. And labor just has never really recovered from that period. There hasn't been I mean, I'm sure you guys, if you guys ever worked at like Walmart or Amazon or any of those places, in the first day of working there, you have an hour-long video that talks about why unions are bad and why you should never, ever, ever join a union and all this other stuff. So the firms are wise to it, and they're doing everything that they can within their legal means to ensure that their businesses and or states are very unfriendly to unions, because that means that they'd have to pay their workers more, and their workers would have collective bargaining power, and it'd be more difficult for them to get higher profits. Which brings us to our third trend that we talked about. So this is increased wage inequality. And so for this one, we're just going to be talking about in the US. It's funny because we're talking about the increased wage inequality in the US, but we live in an interconnected world, right? So even though we're just talking about wage inequality in the US, what is this being impacted from? It's being impacted by globalization, right? Globalization has expanded the ease of goods and services to cross borders, which also makes it easier to produce goods and services in, many different places, most of which are not the US. So, globalization results in, formerly domestically produced goods being replaced by cheaper foreign-made imports. So the result of globalization is some domestic sectors shrink. So we'll do an example using our supply and demand equations or model. Got two markets starting out exactly the same. Let's see if I can do this right. So the market that we have on the left is going to be our textiles market. So, all of our clothing, right? Hats, shirts, jeans, socks, dishes, right? Anything that's woven, made with fabric. And then software as our other sector. And so what have we seen historically in the United States, right? 100 years ago or 50 years ago, there was a lot of textile production here in the United States, right? Well, what ended up happening is that once globalization, made it easier to import and export textiles, the demand for domestic textiles decreased as some textiles are bought overseas. This is going to cause the wages in the textile industry to decrease and going to cause the employment to decrease as well. Whereas in the software industry, right, because of the fact that, that's a high-skilled industry, we have a lot of exports of software here in the United States, right? And so as globalization has increased that, there's a shift outwards in the demand, the labor demand for software workers. That's going to result in what? A higher equilibrium wage and a greater amount of employment. So there's a wage differential now, right? That's between these two workers that didn't exist before. So we've seen this over and over again. You know, it doesn't have to be the textile industry. It's just any kind of low skill industry. They face the toughest international competition. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a race to the bottom, right? A lot of these countries don't have as much labor standards as us, right? They don't have as much environmental regulations as us. And so it just becomes cheaper. You pay people less and you can pollute more in these other countries. But as a result of this, there's increasing political resistance to the whole notion of free trade, which we saw in the previous administration, right? Now, this kind of, freaking out about industry, about robots and stuff taking our jobs, it's been going on for over 100 years, right? There's this guy, I think it's William Ludd, but he's been kind of immortalized in history in this term Luddite, which is somebody who is against technological progress. The book also talks about this guy, I don't remember his name, but he died trying to pile drive his way into a mountain because he was trying to prove that he was that he could chip into a mountain faster than a steam engine or whatever. There's been cases of over and over again, some funnier and more descriptive than the other, but there's when the internet came out, everyone was freaking out thinking, well, libraries, what about libraries? Libraries are going to go away, bookstores are going to go away, what's going to happen to all those jobs? It's going to happen to all those people. So what we actually end up finding is that there's quite a bit of worker mobility. So, yes, your sector or, the textile sector or something like that might be impacted, or let's say the car manufacturing sector might be impacted, but, you can retrain and reskill and, next thing you know, you'll be on the production line for making windmills or solar panels or something like that, right? One of those, a new industry, right? So there's job destruction and there's job creation, right? And this worker mobility is the movement of workers between jobs, firms, and industries. So, there's market incentives, right? There's a higher wage to move from, the textile industry to the programming industry, right? But it's not that easy. You gotta train, you gotta learn. So transition aid that's provided by the government is often the best and only recourse. There's no stopping globalization. It's best to just adapt to it. So what we've seen here in the United States, right? We've seen something called skill-biased technical change, or technological, excuse me. So it's probably one of the most jargony words that we're going to learn in this 8 weeks. And so this is something, some advance in technology that impacts the marginal productivity of higher skilled workers differently than those of lower skilled workers. So, for instance, you'll see automobile lines increasingly, replacing humans with robots. But the design of those cars, or the design of the process, or that supply chain, or the industrial systems, right, is still done by workers, right? So you still need workers who can program / fix the robots. So when we look at skill-based technological change graphically, it's going to be the exact same graph that we just had when we talked about textiles and computers. So we're just going to do it really fast. So for unskilled, skilled, supply, demand 2, demand 2. So once again, this creates a wage differential between those high-skilled and those unskilled laborers, which is part of why income inequality is getting worse and worse in the United States. It's because of skill-biased technical change. Technological change. All right, so any questions on that last trend? We'll talk about the different types of unemployment, talk about some structural barriers to employment, and then move on and start chapter 9. No questions? Awesome. So the different types of unemployment. So we've got 3 different types of unemployment. We've got frictional unemployment. And this is just when you're between jobs. So it's short duration, low economic cost, and some of this may actually increase economic efficiency. So, we never expect this to be 0. Whereas cyclical unemployment, we don't have to redo unemployment. Cyclical unemployment, this is unemployment like we just had during the COVID, right? During economic slowdowns. So usually it's short duration. And unlike frictional unemployment, there's a larger economic cost in terms of lower real GDP. Our last type of unemployment is structural unemployment. This is the worst kind. This is long-term, chronic unemployment within a well-functioning economy. So we're about to have a crap ton of structural unemployment if self-driving trucks become a thing anytime soon, because that's like the #1 job in a lot of the Midwest states. And those people don't have a lot of qualifications outside of that, right? And so if all of those jobs just all of a sudden up and go, we're going to have a real bad structural unemployment problem with those workers. So structural unemployment, there's a lot of structural unemployment in Europe because of all the immigrants, right? There's a lack of skills, there's language barriers. I was in Greece 2 summers ago, and the unemployment rate's like 25% there. Part of it's because of all the immigrants. They don't know the language. They don't, how can you get a job if you don't know the language? And then also part of it is, discrimination. Just good old-fashioned discrimination. You're not one of my people, so I don't want to take a chance on you. So these structural shifts in production, so the structural employment, it comes from in production. These structural shifts in production create mismatches between worker skills and the market needs. There are also some things that contribute to structural unemployment. These contributors you'll also hear spoken of as barriers to employment. The first one that's often talked about and that we'll talk about today is minimum wage. The second one, very, very relevant given what's going on right now, unemployment insurance. And then we'll touch on it briefly because, like I said, labor is pretty dead and it's not showing any sign of resuscitation, so I don't even know why they have this here, but unions. Unions are said to be one barrier to employment. So this structural unemployment is just bad news. It's got high, economic costs, psychological costs, and social costs. So, the cell phone manufacturing industry, the phone manufacturing industry, the U.S. steel industry, the U.S. auto industry, a lot of these, right, are examples of situations where structural changes in production created structural unemployment. So the first one, like I said, we're going to talk about is the minimum wage. So the minimum wage, how do we go about talking about this? Well, we're going to use our supply and demand model, of course, right? So we got real wages on the y-axis, we've got employment on the x-axis, we've got a downward sloping demand curve. Boop. Demand for labor, and we have an upward sloping supply curve. Boop. And so if the government comes in and says, well, you can't pay anybody less than, what is the minimum wage actually in Nebraska? $7.75? Something like that. So they say you can't pay anybody less than $7.75 an hour. Well, at $7.75 an hour, there's this many people. This is the number of laborers, right? The quantity of laborers willing to work. But at $7.75, or actually, sorry, I got that wrong. This is the quantity of laborers that the firms are looking to hire at this rate. Apologies. So this is the firm, and the demand for labor, this is you. You're the one that's selling your labor. Wait. Did I have it right? Where the minimum wage makes it so that the quantity that is supplied no, we're the supply of the labor. The demand of the labor is the firm. I did have it right. Good old left-right dyslexia. So supply of labor is you, the consumer, the workers. The demand for the labor, that's the employers. We're used to being the ones that are demanding things because we're typically talking about consumption, right? So if the minimum wage is set at $7.75, well then at that rate, you've got this many people that they actually want to be hired. That's how many the laborers, I should probably do that in blue, huh? Since everything's been confused. So this is at 775. When we reflect that off of the blue, which is the employer thing, that's telling me the number hired at that particular wage. Then when I reflect it off of my supply line, well, at 775, you've got all of these people that are willing to work. And so as a result, this policy, which is meant to, increase the welfare of those people in that lower part of the spectrum, right? It has this unintended consequence of creating unemployment, right? Because the quantity supplied of workers is going to be much greater than the quantity demanded of workers at that minimum wage. So people that are against minimum wage laws, the argument is, well, if we didn't have this barrier, then the wages would be allowed to adjust and more people would have a job. But if that were the case, then yes, more people would have a job, but they'd have a job at what? A lower wage. It would be something like $6 an hour. So one of the things that, actually it's very relevant because I was just at the RBLI thing and we had a speaker and he was talking about how it's impossible for him to find and keep workers. And it's been worse lately, and he thinks part of it is because of the unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance, it's a government transfer to those unemployed workers. It's meant to reduce the costs of unemployment, both to the individual and to society as a whole. It gives the unemployed person an incentive to search longer less intensively and hopefully, find a better match. But for unemployment insurance benefits to work efficiently, which a lot of economists, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of articles talking about this and studying this, right? A lot of people would say they are not working efficiently right now because to work efficiently, the unemployment benefits need to be limited in time and should be less than the income received when you were working. I had a buddy who, got fired from his job and was making like hundreds of dollars more than he was making at his job, right? So there was very little incentive for him to go back to his job, except for the fact that he knew that the unemployment benefits were going to run out. But this has been happening at a very, very large scale. And again, we've been seeing the results of it in terms of firms and employers are having a really hard time hiring and keeping laborers. So it's not just these things that are impediments, right? We've got labor unions, and we're going to just quickly talk about, so I'm a little biased since I am the president of the labor union of the CSC faculty, so I am a pro-union. I firmly believe, the only reason that we've been able to get consistent wage increases, is because of the fact that we're unionized, especially during times like this. The collective bargaining power that you have results in a lot less. So there hasn't really been a lot of reduction in enrollment and tuition and stuff like that, right? But they want to claim poor. They want to claim that, because of COVID, everything's frozen. And so they want to increase what's called worker exploitation, right? Worker exploitation is, essentially having the worker work more without paying them any more. And so, yeah, it's I mean, number one, every worker is exploited just because of the nature of capitalism. Like, the only reason somebody hires you is to exploit you. Like, they're hiring you at $6,000 a month, and if you don't help them with producing $6,000 or more a month, then they're going to fire you, right? So every work relationship has exploitation in it, but worker exploitation can get worse and worse and worse over time by the employers, let's say, forcing you to have your email on your phone, forcing you to reply to emails when you're at home over the, at night or over the weekends or over breaks and so on and so forth, right? So having a labor union, having that collective bargaining rights definitely helps reduce the worker exploitation that happens. Now, what's one of the costs of it? Well, it introduces inefficiencies into what would otherwise be, a competitive market. So the benefits of being in a labor union is that, together you can support progressive labor legislation, maybe to increase the safety standards or maybe to increase the overtime pay or something like that, right? What about the costs here? Well, having unions may keep companies from competing globally. Why is that? Again, it comes down to that whole race to the bottom situation, right? Where in all these other countries, there's a lack of labor standards, so you can just treat your employees like dirt. You can have fake safety signs, you can have fake exit doors, and so as a result, if there's a fire or something and 800 people die, it's no sweat off your back. You don't get sued, you don't get in any real trouble. You were a job creator. There's an increase in productivity. You're not as worried about losing your job. You're able to have a greater voice. You're getting more pay raises. So there's a theory in economics called the efficiency wage theory, which is, you should pay somebody more than their value of marginal product, because by paying them more than that, it makes them work really hard and it decreases the amount of turnover. And so it's actually more efficient in the long run to pay more than the value of their marginal product of labor rather than paying exactly that value of marginal product of labor, which is what would happen in the absence of unions. And then this promotes democracy in the workplace. So some of the other costs, though, it can increase the labor supply in the non-union sector. and it can result in decreased wages. These are all really crappy costs. I don't believe any of these for non-union workers. Talking about unions is like a whole chapter in and of itself, especially with like what's going on with Amazon right now. And yeah, so we just got to kind of touch on it, but unfortunately don't have the time to really get into it to the level I'd like to. So last thing before we talk about, we'll talk about Western Europe and then we'll call it a day. We're not gonna be able to get to chapter 9 today, unfortunately, but other government regulations. So I don't know if you guys know about OSHA, right? The Office of Safety and Health and stuff like that, right? So, you know, health and safety regulations can reduce the demand for labor just because it costs more. You know, you got to buy people like PPE and other kind of stuff. You know, you gotta buy people like nuclear reactor suits or whatever. So just it increases the employer costs. And in general, because it's an extra cost, it's going to reduce productivity. That's really the same point. These are the same thing. So reduction in demand will increase unemployment and will lower wages. So if there's excessive regulation, will decrease labor demand and result in lower wages. So lastly, when we're talking about impediments to full employment, we often like to talk about you know, comparing ourselves to our contemporaries, right? You know, our peers. Well, who are our peers? Well, it's Western Europe. So when we talk about the impediments to full employment, which it's often abbreviated as just FE here, and so this is going to be, you know, comparing with Western Europe. So many of these impediments that we just talked about can explain many of the above impediments explain the stark differences in unemployment rate between the United States and Western Europe. European markets are highly regulated. What does this mean? Well, they've got a high minimum wage. Little flexibility in benefits. So reading between the lines, that means they have to provide a lot of benefits, right? And more powerful, still in existence, unions. So this, combined with globalization and skill-based technological change, the result is many workers, many European workers, aren't worth employing given the regulations or the restrictions. In some places, if you give somebody a job, it's pretty much like you have to have like a legal case in order to fire them. Like that's how it is in some of Western Europe. And so as a result, you're very hesitant to hire a new person, right? And so the amount of frictional unemployment, right, that employment between jobs increases significantly as a result. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. We'll pick up here on Monday, and we will start chapter 9.